Thanks for joining me for one of my COVID-19 updates. It's been a couple months since we've been together to talk about how COVID has been trending both here in Philadelphia, around the nation, and around the world. And in that time, the situation has really changed from where we were in the US just a couple of months ago. And that change has really come from the rise of a new variant of the coronavirus called the Delta variant, which I'm sure you've all seen in the news. And we'll get to talk a little bit about how that's changing some of the decisions that we're trying to make as we move into the fall. So for today's conversation, I wanted to really talk about three things that are really hitting the news in the last couple of weeks. First, we found out on Monday that the FDA gave full approval to Pfizer's COVID vaccine. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means and what that might mean for the future. Second, I wanted to talk about what we're learning about the reality of breakthrough infections for people who have been fully vaccinated and still get infected. I feel like there's been a lot of kind of anecdotal data over the last few months, but just in the last few weeks, we're now seeing real data, good data sets with large numbers of people coming out from the CDC that help us understand kind of what we can expect in terms of the frequency and the severity of those breakthrough infections. And finally, putting all these together, what does that mean for the reality of booster shots for everybody? So send us your questions. We'll try and work through based on some of the data that's been coming out. But I think, we're going to be in a place where we're trying to make sense of the world based on incomplete data and uncertainty. And unfortunately, that's a reality of public health in the face of a pandemic. But we'll try and help you make sense of it. Okay, so let's start with the full approval of the Pfizer vaccine. So just a little bit of background. Let's remind ourselves that the study of the Pfizer vaccine was based on looking at 44,000 people in the original clinical trial. Half of those people were given the 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine. The other half received a placebo of a saline solution. And so where we are right now is that we have data on 6 months of those originally 44,000 people. And what we found was that that vaccine is 91% effective in preventing COVID infection, or rather symptomatic COVID infection, and that difference is going to be really important. So what's the difference between what the FDA had previously approved versus where we are today? So the previous term was called an emergency use authorization. So that gives the CDC and doctors the ability to use this medication under a state of emergency, which is what has been declared for COVID. And that only requires 2 months of data. Now that we have the 6 months of data, that's what's required to move forward with this full authorization. And so Pfizer hit that point back in May. They submitted their application in May, and now here we are in August with that full application having granted. So one caveat, because there are 12 to 15-year-olds who are also getting the Pfizer vaccine under that emergency use authorization, that's not yet approved under this full approval because we don't have the 6 months data for those 12 to 15-year-olds yet. So the current full approval only applies to people age 16 and older. Got a question about whether Moderna will also get full approval soon. Moderna has submitted their application to the FDA. They do have those 6 months of data in hand, but they submitted their application in June. So it'll take a little bit more time for Moderna to catch up just in terms of timelines. And for those of us who have the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, they have also are in the process of collecting that data. They have not yet submitted that application to the FDA. So that's kind of where we are with the 3 different vaccines. So let me talk a little bit about what's required in that process to go from the emergency use authorization to the full approval and what that means. So one of the things is that that the Pfizer vaccine can now be marketed directly to consumers. So it now has a brand name called Community, which is a kind of a mixture of COVID and community and immunity and mRNA. And this allows the shot to stay on the market once the pandemic is over. So what was the goal of collecting these 6 months of data? One is to really just to collect continued safety data to understand what the risks of getting the vaccine were. And the safety data was really good. The one additional risk that is now included in the prescription information for the vaccine is that there is a small risk of mild heart inflammation that happens most likely within a week or two of getting the second shot. And this risk is something like 40 per million cases as a conservative estimate. And so that just helps doctors and patients look for it, to be ready for the possibility that might happen and manage any potential issues. And so this vaccine has been based on decades of research. And so let's just talk a little bit again about how the vaccine works. So this is an mRNA vaccine. So what it does is it gives the body the genetic instructions for just building one part of the virus. And this has been under research, like as I said, for decades. It's been tested in clinical trials with other viruses in the past. COVID-19 is the first time that a pandemic has been globally impacted to the point where it's actually been brought to market. So it's an important milestone for this type of technology. But it's a very well-tested technology. So what else is involved? We talked about the safety review, which was the primary goal of the 6 months of data. But it also requires a lot of inspection of the whole production process. So the FDA, in addition to having to review millions of pages of data, they conduct plant inspections to figure out how the vaccine is being made, to make sure that there are quality controls in place, that every vaccine dose is being produced consistently and safely. There's also some negotiation that has to happen about what the information goes on the package. What information do doctors and patients need to know? So those are the kinds of information that are required to go from that emergency use authorization to a full approval. And so, the fact that, the Pfizer submitted the application back in May, here we are in August, it's been interesting to see some of the reactions to this timeframe, because to some people it seems very short, and to some people it feels, way too long. So hopefully understanding the process helps you figure out, what's been happening between May and August. For those for whom it seems like a long time, part of it is because this is one of the rare occasions where millions of people, over 300 million doses of this vaccine have been administered. And so we've had more data on safety and efficacy than for almost any other drug. So the fact that we haven't seen a lot of adverse effects, it feels like, okay, we know this, let's move forward. But of course, we need to go through all of these processes to ensure that we're putting all of the safety checks and rules in place. But to others, of course, it seems short. And how does this happen? And the FDA technically has 8 months from the day the submission is filed to go to review all of the processes and get to full approval. And what the FDA did to speed that timeline up was to reprioritize what its staff was working on. So they took people who were working on other projects and had them focus on figuring out what's happening with the vaccine, so that they could really get all of these reviews done quickly just by getting more people on it. So again, it's not cutting corners. It's really just making sure that by putting just human power and brain power, on this priority, that we're able to get to this full approval as quickly as possible. And so now we know that this particular vaccine technology, works really well. It's the same vaccine technology that is in the Mrna vaccine as that uses mRNA as well. But we're still seeing lots of other vaccines in the pipeline, and some of them use other types of technology where you can isolate a full protein from the virus and use that rather than giving the genetic instructions. So the principle behind all of these vaccines are the same, that ultimately you are introducing a part of the virus to your body so you can develop that immune protection to it when you see the real virus in action. But there are slight differences in the technology that are being used in these different vaccines. The reason that we're seeing the mRNA vaccines come to this stage first is because they're just a lot easier to make. And so that's a real benefit of this technology that we'll see being applied to other diseases in the future as well. So the bottom line for where we are with this full approval, I think that it ends up being kind of both a carrot and a stick for vaccination efforts moving forward. We've heard from a lot of people who, were feeling nervous about the idea of it being under emergency use authorization. And now with the additional data, the safety reviews and the checks that have gone into the full approval, hopefully that boosts confidence in the vaccine for people, and they're ready to get vaccinated now. We'll also see it a little bit of a stick that, with that full approval, I expect that we'll see more vaccine requirements coming out at different levels of our society. And all of that is really tied to getting ourselves back into a place where we can interact with each other and go to school and, carry out business as usual, whatever usual means in our new normal. So that's kind of where we are with the full approval. And now we know that, that the reason that it's important to get this approval and get people vaccinated is because of the Delta variant. So the Delta variant, actually, before I move on to Delta variant, I do want to address someone else's concern about blood clots. So that's been a particular concern around the Johnson & Johnson shot, as well as the AstraZeneca shot that's been used more primarily in Europe. These are small risks of the vaccine. I got the Johnson & Johnson shot again, so this is something that I've read a lot about to be informed. And again, there's no medicine that comes without risk, but it's really a balance of risk and benefit. So for the Johnson & Johnson shot, there is a small risk of blood clots, particularly in younger women. And this is something to be informed about. Again, it is a tiny risk and compared to the risk of getting blood clots from COVID. It's always a choice, between what are the risks you're looking at with getting the vaccine and the risk that you're looking at from getting COVID. And as we talk through some of the data on how the vaccine efficacy is holding up, it really looks like there's just so much benefit from the vaccine that being able to choose between these different vaccines might be something to consider. If you are a woman under 40 or under 50, then maybe you want to go for one of the mRNA vaccines to avoid that small risk of a blood clot. On the other hand, if you have other risk factors to think about, then that may have influenced your choice of which vaccine to get. But ultimately, with the Delta variant coming into play, getting vaccinated is more important than ever. So let's talk a little bit about these breakthrough infections. So one reason that we are seeing more breakthrough infections from people who are vaccinated is because there are more people who are vaccinated. We had, I think, in some ways, some unrealistic expectations of the vaccines. So just to define a term, if there's a vaccine that prevents infection in the first place, that's called having sterilizing immunity. And that was never really the goal of the vaccines, but with the old variant, the alpha variant of the virus, it seemed really good. And so everybody was really excited. It kind of felt like having this vaccine was this cloak of invisibility to the vaccine, I guess. But that's not really how vaccines are intended to work. And now we're seeing kind of a reality check with the Delta variant. So the Delta variant is more contagious because of some of the genetic changes that have occurred in the virus. We still don't know if it necessarily makes you sicker, but we do know that when the virus enters the nose and throat, even in people who have been vaccinated, you do see high levels of the virus accumulating in the nose and throat, which then makes it easier to transmit to someone else. And we just to address a quick question here, how many people need to be vaccinated to reach herd immunity? That's kind of a moving target. Some of the estimates that scientists had predicted back when we were dealing with the alpha variant change now that we're dealing with the Delta variant that is more contagious. But we want to be able to get to a place where, within communities, there are enough people who are immune to be able to protect people who are vulnerable to the disease. But it's hard to know what, a precise number. Basically the more the better. So now that we know that the vaccine doesn't prevent infection, which was probably an unrealistic expectation anyway, how confident can we be in what the vaccines are effective at? And data that's been coming out in the last couple of weeks should be a big confidence boost to everybody who's had the vaccine. So what we know is that these vaccines continue to provide really good protection against severe disease and death, which is what they were designed to do. So we've seen some data from Israel that shows the Pfizer vaccine protects against severe disease, in even over rates of 80%. New data from LA that the CDC just released yesterday shows that unvaccinated people are 29 times more likely to be hospitalized with COVID than somebody who's been fully vaccinated. So these vaccines are really effective in keeping you out of the hospital and keeping your symptoms mild. So that's really great news. But what we do see is the fact that the possibility of getting infected does increase because of the Delta variant. So some of the studies that have shown this have looked at different time periods. So looking at January through May, when the alpha variant was the primary variant circulating in the US and other places in the world, comparing January to May through June through August, as we saw Delta start to rise. And so we do see that more vaccinated people get infected as Delta starts to rise. Now, what does that mean for thinking about, whether our immunity is weakening, whether we need boosters? It's a little muddy because there are some different confounding factors that make it hard to interpret the data. First of all, the lab tests on the vaccines show that they are still effective against the Delta variant. But in the same time that that we're following from January all the way through August, we also see changes in behavior because we went through a period where some of our masking and distancing restrictions were relaxed. And then we started to see more increases in the levels of virus in the community. So all of these are make it a little bit hard to really get a sense of how much weaker that immunity can be. So this is a great question. Can you test for a specific variant? Yes, it does require a genetic test. And from what I've read, these are tests that are done in labs to basically trace what kind of variants are out there in the population. But it's not something that you would necessarily get if you get tested for COVID. They're not going to tell you which variant you've been infected with. So it's more of what we call surveillance testing to kind of figure out what's happening in a population, but not at an individual level. So hopefully that answers that question. Okay, so that brings up this last issue about boosters. So do we need boosters? And there are differing opinions among scientists about this. So the rationale for boosters is that because we're potentially seeing a weakening in vaccine protection, we need to get ahead of the game. That we need to get everybody boosters to be prepared for things to get worse. Before I talk about that, I should clarify that a third vaccine dose has already been approved for people who have pre-existing conditions. And that technically doesn't count as a booster because the assumption is that for those people, 2 doses weren't enough to get them up to what would be considered the expected level of immunity because of their compromised immune systems. So that third dose for people who are immunocompromised with other conditions is not technically considered a booster. So when we talk about boosters, what we're talking about are a third dose for everybody else who's considered part of the healthy population. So again, so that's the rationale for giving a third dose to everybody, is that let's get ahead of the game. But other scientists say that, hey, these vaccines are really effective in preventing severe disease and death with just 2 doses. And so as we think about where the need for vaccines is, we should really prioritize getting vaccines out to the rest of the world. And Delta is kind of the example that suggests why that's something really important to consider, because a pandemic is global in our global society. That a variant that arises in one part of the world is going to spread, as we've seen with each of these successive variants coming out, and so the more we can suppress the disease, the fewer times that virus replicates, the fewer chances there are to end up with new variants of the disease. So that's the rationale for saying, no, let's hold back on boosters in US and other countries that are starting to think about that booster shot. And let's prioritize getting that vaccine out to the rest of the world, because suppressing COVID globally is going to help everybody. So I don't have a crystal ball to tell you which way it's going to go. Certainly the Biden administration is hoping to start boosters for everyone in September. But the FDA and the CDC's advisory committees have not yet voted on whether to move forward with that plan. So stay tuned in the next couple of weeks. We'll get a better sense, once there's more discussion about the pros and cons of either moving forward with boosters or thinking about kind of keeping them that third shot just for the people who really need it, and really trying to expand the number of people who are vaccinated with the basic dose first. The good news, though, is that people keep asking, and again, having been one of the people who got the Johnson & Johnson shot, what's the story? So far, that even the data on Johnson & Johnson being protective against the Delta variant is really good. But there are clinical trials in process about an additional dose for people who got the Johnson & Johnson shot, both a second shot of the same vaccine as well as mixing and matching with some of the mRNA viruses. So again, we'll see how that plays out as we get more data. So that's kind of the story of where we are right now. Obviously, things going to keep changing, and we'll be back once we have another, more and more of the story to tell. But here we are. I hope this helps you understand now that we're looking at entire data sets as opposed to just headlines here and there about what we're looking at in terms of both the protection of the vaccine against the Delta variant, as well as what we take away from the breakthrough infections and the need for boosters. So please continue to send us your questions. We're happy to answer them. And thanks for joining us today for this COVID update.